Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today, somebody you are probably very familiar with, Dr. Amy C. Edmondson. She is the professor of leadership and management at the Harvard Business School, best-selling author of a couple of books. Her most famous, which has been out for a few years now, is The Fearless Organization, and she's also the author of a book that just is coming out called Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. I had a chance to read an advanced reader copy, which I got right here. A lot of cool stuff in there. So Amy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about vulnerability too, because I know that was mentioned in the book. And I'm really excited to get into some of the themes in there. Why don't we jump into just some background information about why this book? So obviously you wrote The Fearless Organization, which really pioneered this era or this area of psychological safety. How is that related to failure?
Well, psychological safety is so necessary for us to handle failure. That's the short answer, right? And to back up, why should we handle failure? Well, we have no real choice, right? Failure is here to stay. Failure is with us because we live in an uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. So psychological safety describes an environment which, simply it could be described just as a learning environment.
Yeah.
But an environment where people feel confident that they can take the interpersonal risks of learning, speaking up, admitting a mistake, pointing to a failure, offering a dissenting view. And so, I've been studying, I'd say, the organizational culture and organizational climate for a really long time. And the theme of failure and error and mishap and accidents, and just lack of success in some settings is always there. It's always lurking in the background, sometimes in the foreground. So I decided to put it squarely in the foreground.
Yeah, and there's always been lots of, especially in Silicon Valley, right? What does everybody always say? Fail fast and break things, or fail fast and move on. And failure, I think, has been a big part, especially of the tech culture, which
Yes.
I found very, very interesting. What does failure actually mean? Like, if you were to define failure, is it just any mistake that you make? Does it matter the size and scale of the failure, or is it just anything that doesn't go well?
Well, failure is any result or any event that is not what was desired. And so it's the lack of a hoped for result. And so mistakes are in the same domain, but they're not the same concept. And maybe a mistake is defined as something that you did wrong where there was a right way to do it. Sometimes a failure involves something going wrong where there was a right way to do it, but other failures are in genuinely new territory. So, and keep in mind, you can make a mistake and have it not produce a failure, right? I can mistakenly put the milk in the cupboard instead of the fridge, but catch it later and the milk didn't go bad, right? So there's plenty of mistakes that we can make that we, either catching correct before they cause harm, or they really weren't such a big deal to end up causing anything we'd remotely want to call a failure.
Okay.
So, and part of my goal in this book is to kind of help us have better terminology so that we're not, and in particular, I don't want us to equate mistakes and failures. And the main reason is that I don't want us to think about failures in new territory as mistakes, because they're not, right? You could not have done better even if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And of course you did want to, right? Because you lacked the knowledge you needed.
Okay.
Any inventor is in new territory. They're not making a mistake when their invention fails.
Okay. Got it. So for people tuning in, just to give them a little bit of context on what we're going to do, we're going to talk a lot about failure, different types of failures. You have some frameworks and models in the book. And then for the last 15, 20 minutes or so, we can look at how to actually practice failing well. And that's when we'll get into themes like vulnerability, learning over knowing, reframing. You have a framework in there, stop, challenge, choose. I don't know if we'll get into all the different questions I have for you, but I had a lot in that area.
Great.
So let's dive into these 3 archetypes of failure, because I think that's how you set the stage for the book. We have basic, complex, and intelligent. So how do you distinguish between those 3, and actually why do we even need to distinguish between those types of failures?
Well, you started out by saying there's, virtually an ethos or a mantra in Silicon Valley: fail fast, break things, and then of course that sounds good in a way, except that most of us think, yeah, right. Not in my job, right? That won't work. I'm not, I don't get rewarded for failing. And so the problem with the fail fast, fail often idea is that it is absolutely powerful for some contexts. And so when we don't have, my argument is, if we don't have a good framework to distinguish the different types of failures and the different types of contexts, then we just kind of hear the rhetoric. We might go along with it as happy talk, but we know deep in our hearts it makes no sense. But I think deep in our hearts it can make sense, so long as we make the right distinctions. So what are they? The domain where fail fast, break things makes sense is the domain of intelligent failure. Okay. And an intelligent failure is any failure that happens in new territory, in pursuit of a goal, with a hypothesis, or at least good reason to believe it might work, right? It might not, but it might. And finally, that it's no bigger than it has to be to gain the knowledge you need, right? To know whether something is going to work, right? So when entrepreneurs are trying a new company or developing a new product, they want it to succeed just like the rest of us. But because it's new, because you can't know for sure, it might not, right? But they don't bet their entire assets on an unproven project. They do it at the right scale. So that's the right kind of wrong, intelligent failure. New territory, goal, in pursuit of a goal with a hypothesis as small as possible. The other 2 kinds are generally worth preventing when we can, right? And they're the basic failures and the complex failures. Basic failures are single cause failures caused by a mistake, in known territory. I backed out of the driveway too fast, I hit a wall. Right? I dented my thing, I just caused like $1,000 worth of body damage. That is a basic failure. It's a real drag. It is preventable, had I backed out slowly, carefully, etc. So I don't think it would make any sense to celebrate those, right? Like, why would you want to celebrate, just some stupid mistake you make that creates a failure? What we do want to celebrate is sort of care and diligence when people avoid, they good catches in a way. Anyway, the third kind are complex failures, which are multi-causal. They're the perfect storms. They're the kinds of failures that happen when, for whatever reason or bad luck, a bunch of things lined up in just the wrong way and created a failure, right? And they are they're on the rise because of the complexity of our world. But the good news about complex failures is that they offer many different opportunities to catch and prevent them.
And I think, isn't one of the examples that you have of complex failure, was that the Boeing 737?
Yes, that's one of the more complex examples of a complex failure. And I use that one to say that sometimes a complex failure literally plays out over decades, right? The various factors that contribute to, say, the devastating crashes and losses of life of the 737 MAX accidents. In those were not, those weren't just quick, one day someone did something wrong. Those were a very large number of factors that played out over decades.
And what about, so I'm curious, just kind of 2 random examples, and these are 2 recent things that happened, right? One is the Titan submersible that, of course, imploded. And the other recent one is like Sam Bankman-Fried and the FTX example. Would you put both of those in the complex category?
Yes, I think they're both complex failures because there's multiple causes.
Okay.
And I think they're both, largely speaking, preventable. And so, the the beauty of complex failures is they give you lots of different opportunities for prevention.
Yeah.
And the Titan, we could talk about a prevention opportunity that existed the day they took off or on the voyage, despite warnings, despite the limitations of the technology. And so that would be a great example. Let's just say the Titan for a moment. It's a great example of a failure that is not something to celebrate. Obviously,
Yep.
right? It was foreseeable and preventable, and yet it wasn't just a single mistake. That day someone put the gear in the wrong direction and made a failure. It was a whole handful of factors and incentives and ego and lack of training and material flaws and on it goes.
Yeah. So kind of the way that I conceptualize this, like a basic failure is almost like an unforced error, right? In any kind of a sport, somebody passes the ball, didn't catch it, goes out of bounds.
Yep.
It's that kind
Basic
of simple.
failure.
The way that I'm kind of envisioning a complex failure is almost like not necessarily like a series of basic failures, but it's kind of like a more, I don't know, a more complex version of a basic failure
Yes.
where several things like
Yeah.
that went wrong,
Right.
but also
And,
preventable.
and any one of them on their own wouldn't have produced the failure.
Yeah.
Right? Like that you sort of needed all of them coming together. Same
Yeah.
with the Titan, right? It had been underwater many times before and had not had its catastrophic end. But the sheer number of factors kind of coming together.
Yeah. So kind of going back to the sports analogy, it's like, well, we lost the game not because of one pass, but because overall for the whole game we didn't play well. There were a lot of mistakes and stuff like that. So let's go over those 4 criteria for intelligent failures one more time, because I think
Sure.
we went over it quickly and I think they're really important. And so you had new territory, opportunity to advance toward desired goal, hypothesis driven, and small, and can still provide valuable insights. So first one, new territory. So are we talking about something totally different? Like I'm a maker of water bottles and now I'm going to start producing textbooks. Could it be a different?
Doesn't have to be.
Okay.
Right? So new territory to me can, in some cases, like if you're a leading scientist at a university, for example, it can be brand new to the world. Like you're asking a question or trying to produce a result that no one yet knows how to do. Right. But for the rest of us, new territory can be new to you. And unless it's like a recipe for making something which you could just look up and then use it, which you should then do, but it's something new, like finding you're going to go on a date with someone you've never met before, right? That's new territory. There's no way to know in advance for sure whether it will go well or not. So you're sort of willing to take that risk because you can look to your right, you can look to your left, but there's no place you can find the information that you want, or the knowledge you want to know whether this is going to be a great fit or not.
Okay, so it's more like uncertainty, risk, that kind of element. Okay.
Yes. Uncertainty is probably the most precise single word. If you had to have one single word, there's genuine uncertainty. You can't make it go away. Right? You can't just find the knowledge on the internet and say, oh, now I know. I'll just do X and Y will happen. There's genuine uncertainty.
Hey, really quick. 96% of the people who watch this video, just like you, are not subscribed to the channel. Can you please do me a huge favor and subscribe to the channel? It'll take you 1 second. It helps me grow the channel and you'll get access to more videos just like this one. Make sure to subscribe. And now let's get back to the content. And the second criteria, the opportunity towards advancing towards a desired goal. Somebody might say, isn't everything advancing towards a desired goal? Or like, right? I mean, inside of an organization, for example, don't we always do something toward moving towards a goal?
Well, that's a great point. Although, many senior executives would say, I wish that were true, right?
Yeah.
I wish that what everybody was doing all day long was always in pursuit of our goal. So what that is saying is there ought to be, and this can be a subjective test, but there ought to be a credible argument that this is worth trying. Right? Like if it works, it takes us a step forward toward a goal. Right? So what I'm trying to do is take away the kinds of failures that happened where we had no business messing with that in the first place.
Hmm.
I could decide as an employee of a company that I'm going to make an expensive purchase on behalf of the company of a piece of equipment that we don't even really credibly need to produce our services. Our the value that we give to our customers, right? So it's got to be on the critical path toward where we're trying to go.
Hmm.
Now that could be, finding a life partner. That could be
Yep.
developing a new drug. It could be winning a baseball game, right? But it's in your mind, and hopefully you could check this out with others if there's any doubt. It's worth the risk, right? It's worth trying it.
What happens if the goal? So I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this because I'm thinking of, for example, Enron. I'm thinking of, for example, like Bernie Madoff,
Oh,
FTX, all these different institutions where the goal was to create a successful company, to grow, to make more money, which technically they did. But of course, we all know how those stories have ended. So I guess what I'm trying to find out is what happens if the goal takes over as far as ethics,
yeah.
morality, doing the right thing. Like, does that matter for the goal?
That's a great question. And when I think about causes of failure, I usually I mean I make a distinction between mistake and sabotage, right? If you're if you're but this isn't sabotage. Like this is but the perpetration of fraud is indeed failure. Um, is it intelligent? In this case,
Yeah,
I
like Enron,
think,
where they clearly
yeah,
they clearly
the
lied on the whole.
goal, yeah, yeah. I mean, the goal, in a sense, I guess it could technically fit if you're thinking in terms of, it was a valued goal by the owners. If the goal for them was to continue to perpetuate this fraud, and if they were kind of experimenting with things to see what worked, what kinds of ways you can pull the wool over someone's eyes, and you find, oh, that doesn't work so well, that does work. And, they were making progress toward their goal. Now, I suppose, we could say, yeah, but why, how can it count when that's not a goal we approve of? It's a tricky line to draw, right?
Hmm.
Because there might be lots of goals. If you have kids, there might be goals that your kids are pursuing that you don't approve of, right? Or friends and so forth. So I, I think that I think that the goal could still work even if it's a goal of an unethical goal.
Okay.
Doesn't mean it doesn't mean we approve of it, right? But
Yeah.
it does mean it may, in fact, because really what we're talking about here is thoughtful experimentation to make progress in unknown territory.
Yep.
And if you had a magic wand, you'd make all those thoughtful experiments end in success. But since you don't have a magic wand, some of those thoughtful experiments will end in failure.
Yep. Okay, and then we have hypothesis driven and small and
Hmm.
can still provide valuable insights. So hypothesis driven, I take to assume that you're not guessing, you're making these decisions based
Exactly.
on quantitative, qualitative data. Like you're being smart about it. You're not just let's put
You're
all of
just
our
being
money.
thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think the simplest way to put it is there's good reason to believe it might work.
Okay. And then the last one, which I thought was interesting, is kind of the size and the context matters too. So
Right.
providing small enough so that it can provide a valuable insight. So again, not going all in, something that you can test and just see what you're finding out.
You ought to be motivated to reduce waste, right? So you want your experiment or your test, and ergo your failure, to be no bigger than it has to be, to give you the
Okay.
information you need to go to make the next step.
Okay. So then it sounds like for people who are listening and watching, the idea is you want to avoid basic failures, you want to avoid complex failures, it's not to say that you want intelligent failures, but from the three types of failures, the intelligent ones are the ones that you can actually learn from. And
Right. Well, you can learn from all of them, right?
okay.
We can always learn from our failures, right? But you don't want them, right? But you can still learn from. I mean, please do learn from them, right? Because if you have them, and you probably still will keep having them, you might as well learn from them.
Yeah.
Like get all the value you can from them. But I'll say, yeah, for intelligent failures, in fact, it's not bad advice to say let's have more of them. Because if you're not having enough of them, you're not pushing the envelope. You're not stretching. You're not doing what a former boss of mine said, playing to win, right? You're not going for it. Like you're playing it safe.
Okay. So between all the different types of failures, the one that you want are intelligent failures.
Yep.
And then kind of getting back to this theme of psychological safety and failure, would it be safe to say that in organizations where you don't have psychological safety, you'll see more basic and complex failures and less intelligent failures?
I think it is safe to say that.
Okay.
Because one of the major causes of basic and complex failures alike is people not speaking up when they see something wrong, right? Or they see something that may end up producing a failure. And it's just they're afraid to speak up. They don't want to tell the boss. They don't want to, they don't want to look bad. So, and psychological safety describes a context where they will take that interpersonal risk of speaking up. So many of the failures I have studied could quite directly have been in organizations, have been avoided had people been able to speak up earlier in the process.
Okay. And what would be the relationship between this idea of failure and vulnerability? So I think you touched on it in a couple of different points in the book. And obviously I interviewed you for my book on leading with vulnerability, which is, bringing together the competence and the connection piece in there. But what is the relationship in your book between mistakes, or I should say failures? I'm not going to use mistakes anymore. And
mistakes is okay. Like we'll make those too. I promise. There's the chapter 2 is called. Chapter 3 is called "To Err is Human." Right?
Yeah.
It's that old phrase. Like we don't want to make mistakes. We want to do our very best to minimize them. But we have to accept that So that's part of being vulnerable is to accept that you will make mistakes. The way I talk about vulnerability most often is as follows. Vulnerability is a fact. Each and every one of us is a fallible human being living in a very complex, fallible world. And so we're vulnerable. Like by definition, if you woke up this morning, you're vulnerable. And so the real question, like the emotional question, the wisdom question is, are you okay with that? Right? If you're okay with the fact of your vulnerability, you will show up differently for others, right? You will just show up as someone who isn't trying to show off all the time or trying to look perfect or be seen as someone who has never made a mistake in her life, right? So you'll be more willing to kind of deal with the reality of our vulnerability.
Don't you not have a choice though when you say like be okay with it? Like life doesn't care if you're okay with it or not. It's just like you say, a fact of life. So what if you're not okay with it, or is it more of not willing to acknowledge it?
Yeah, I think it's both. Maybe the way I'm thinking about not being okay with it is it's a sort of denial mechanism. It's a you're just keeping it at bay. You're unwilling to look at it. And so you're trying to act as if it's not there, which I think is hard work and maybe even gets in the way. In fact, I'm sure it gets in the way of really clear thinking, and certainly gets in the way of other orientation. Being curious and interested in and present for other people.
Do you have any examples or stories that come to mind for the intelligent failure? I think wasn't Rene Redzepi? He was actually one of the people I interviewed on my podcast as well from NOMA, and probably a lot of people are not familiar with his story. It's really a crazy story with him. And I think even the show on Hulu, The Bear, the main character is supposed to be somebody who worked at NOMA for Rene Redzepi, although it's not explicitly stated. Can you share a little bit about that story? And am I correct? And that's kind of the intelligent uh, failure
Yeah,
category?
it's in the intelligent failure chapter, and I talk about his story and his restaurant Noma, and as he embodies the kind of elite failure practitioner idea, where you're really at the leading edge of your craft, and if you're there, guess what? There will be failures, and so he. It's funny because he didn't start out okay with failure, right?
Yeah.
He started out, and his, all of the young chefs, aspiring chefs in his kitchen and in his restaurant were quite terrified of him, and he was, really tough if they experimented with a dish and brought it forward and it, wasn't exquisite. He would not have the most positive, supportive response, and
It wouldn't be a lot of,
he
it's
was just
okay, you tried. It would be
right. You tried, or
throw
yeah,
it at
like
the wall.
or this is, it's interesting, and all the rest. So, he gradually he learned that without failures, but and fortunately, behind closed doors, you don't do that. You don't serve your real guests the failed dishes. You serve them the ones that worked out. And so he learned that if we can't do this behind closed doors, we can't be innovative. And he started to really almost preach the failure gospel, and write. He started writing about it in his own journal, and describing sort of, almost the fun of trying things on the absolute leading edges of what were possible, and some will work and some won't, and really starting to say, this is the secret sauce of our success, is our ability to fail well, again, behind closed doors. But then he got to a situation where he was having failure of another kind, which is hadn't managed the finances very well, and was sort of in a big sea of red ink, and had to pause and figure out, where did we go wrong, and where did this come from? How was it that we weren't able to actually make money doing what we do? But I sorted that out too. So I think success in the sort of leading edge of any domain is going to come with different kinds of failures along the way.
And for people not familiar with him, he won the world's best chef several years. His restaurant, Noma,
Best restaurant.
world's best
Yep.
restaurant. I think it was like 4 or 5 times, to the point where they actually had to
Five.
change the rules so that he couldn't even win anymore, because he kept winning so much. So it's really a crazy story. And then, isn't it also true? Like he kept. I think he was telling me every year, every 2 years, they like close down the restaurant, they shut everything down, and they go open up pop-ups in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And he recently announced, right, in 2024, they're just closing for good. They're done.
At the end of 2024, they'll close for good. And then he's going to pivot to a kind of internet-based business for innovation in cuisine. So we don't know exactly what that means, but stay tuned.
Yeah, that'll be pretty cool. So failure is, something that we all experience, we all go through. And some people, I find, are able to look at that failure and turn it into a positive experience. And other people look at that failure as a reason for why they should never do it again. What do you think the key difference is? Like, how can we take failures that we experience and turn them into these learning moments and positives, instead of using these failures as pivotal moments that define why we can't move ahead and can't do anything else?
Well, I hesitate to call it, a sort of a trait that you're born with, because I don't think it is. I think all little kids are fine. You learn to walk, you fall, you
Yeah, exactly.
learn again, you learn to ride a bike, right? This is sort of, we're naturally able to do this, but by the time you're a working adult, or even a middle schooler in elementary school or middle school, you've internalized a kind of cultural belief that you have to get things right, not wrong. That there's right answers, and the cool kids are the ones who succeed, don't fail. So we internalize these messages, and then we get rigid, and then we get afraid. But I think the best answer to your question, like what does it take, is probably the number one thing that matters is a growth mindset, referring to like what Carol Dweck terms, growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, right? Which is a
Yeah.
kind of a belief that, your capabilities are a work in progress. They're something that you can improve through stretching. Through you get smarter as you take on challenging goals, and you learn, and you learn from your failures. You get more athletic as you run or do whatever sport you like to do. So this idea that I can't fail, I can only learn and grow, and you internalize it to be something that you actually believe. And I have two sons. One of them was a little bit more instinctively this way from an early age, right? He just was always sort of, tell me what I did wrong so I can get better. And you're like, wow, really? That's what you want? Okay, yeah, I can help you with that, right? So he seemed to have a little bit of an intrinsic advantage in that sense, but I think it can be learned by all of us. I think another aspect is a kind of supportive community, whether that's your team or your family or your or friendship group, right? A community that kind of rewards this type of thinking and acting, and that rewards the sharing, right? Because we don't have to have all our failures ourselves. We can have some of them vicariously. If you tell me something you tried and it didn't work, then I don't have to try that.
The time has finally come. My brand new book, Leading with Vulnerability, is officially out. If you want to know the difference between being vulnerable at work and why it can hurt you versus leading with vulnerability and why that can be your greatest superpower, then head over to leadwithvulnerability.com to learn more and grab a copy of the book. Sneak peek, vulnerability is about exposing a gap, and leading with vulnerability is about exposing a gap and demonstrating what you are trying to do to close it. So how do you actually do that? Again, head over to leadwithvulnerability.com to learn more and find out. So before we jump into some action items, there's kind of one, I don't know if you'd call it a framework, but you had kind of a breakdown of the failure landscape in there. And you talked about predictable and basic, variable and complex, and novel and intelligent. And I really liked, you had like the nice chart in there that broke all these things down. I think it was 9 quadrants.
Yep.
So what is that, and why is that so important for people to know? Because obviously we have the 3 archetypes of failures, which to me, it seems like whenever a failure does occur, that's
all you need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So why the?
I mean, the 3 archetypes matter, but I think one of the real competencies that you need, to sort of master this stuff is context awareness. Now, this is so simple, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but there's really 2 key dimensions. Right? One is, you used this word before, how much uncertainty is there? Because there are domains, like if I'm going to go down and make a tray of chocolate chip cookies later today, I can almost guarantee that the result will be fine. Right? I'm just going to follow the recipe. I'm going to put the oven at the right. It's just, there's almost zero uncertainty there.
And you would give me one of those chocolate chip cookies, I'm assuming.
I'll give you one. I'll save you one. And so, so how much uncertainty is there? Because the more uncertainty, the more possibility there is for failure. Just logically true.
Yep.
Right? And then the other important dimension, again, so crazy, so simple, is what's at stake. Right. And when you say what's at stake, like what are we putting at risk if we try something that might not work out? And that can be financial, reputational, or human safety. Right. And so, obviously if like human life is at stake, we want to be a lot more cautious than if we're just, playing a game in our basement. Right. So sizing up the context is something that elite failure practitioners do effortlessly. The rest of us can sort of think it through, but if we're in a sort of very a high stakes setting, we've got to proceed cautiously, very thoughtfully. If we're in a really well understood setting, and so the diagram, the 9-cell diagram you brought up, basically makes the point that in known territory, like very consistent, recognizable context where there's recipes for getting the result, Most common failure that you're likely to make is a basic failure, right? You make a you do it in your sleep. Nope, you shouldn't do
Yep.
things in your sleep. You should pay attention, be mindful, right? You do it in your sleep, you make a mistake, and you get a bad outcome. The most sort of prototypical failure type in a complex setting, like an operating room or in aviation, would be a complex failure where multiple factors come together, just the wrong way. And the typical type of failure in brand new, uncertain, unknown territory would be an intelligent failure, right? Because you're
Yeah.
thoughtfully experimenting. But if you think about it a little further, it becomes clear that you can make a basic failure in a lab. Right? You accidentally mix up the wrong chemicals. You take the wrong chemical off the shelf to do your experiment, and you don't get the result you want. It wasn't because your hypothesis was wrong. It's because you made a kind of a dumb mistake.
Yeah.
It exists. It's a possibility, but I call these, and you can have an intelligent failure in a very routine. You can vary that recipe to see whether it actually tastes better. You have good reason to believe it might, but
Yeah.
it comes out not as good, right? So that was an intelligent failure, worth trying. Could have been great, right? It could have been the dish of the year. So I found it fun actually to think of examples in all 9 cells,
Yeah.
and just to make the point that in a way, part of the expertise here is to master not only awareness of the failure types but also awareness of the context, and then again, we have this invitation to do as best we can to avoid the preventable and complex failures, no matter where we are, through vigilance, through training, through teamwork, and to push ourselves to have more of the intelligent failures, especially in new territory, but possibly anywhere.
How does trust play into this? And I have a couple of trust questions for you, but
Okay.
like I'm really interested, for example, in the intersection of trust and vulnerability, trust and mistakes, trust, psychological safety. It seems like
Yeah,
trust comes up in everything. So
it's true.
for failure, I mean, I would imagine that the more trust you have, or the more trust a team has amongst each other and with their leaders, the more of the intelligent failures you would see. Whereas if there's not a lot of trust,
Huh.
maybe you would see more of the basic or complex because people aren't speaking up. They're not sharing. They're not
Right.
talking about what they've learned. They're just, trying to hide things. So I don't
Right.
know.
And they're anxious, right? They're anxious, and so
Yeah,
they might
yeah.
be more at risk for making mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I think that's right.
how does trust play a role
I mean,
in failure?
trust is such a big it's such a big word.
Yeah.
It means at least 3 different things. Like, one being, do I trust your intentions? Do I expect that you will behave, in a trustworthy way as you said you would? Right. And another very different meaning is, do I trust your competence? Now, that has no character aspersion at all. Maybe you just haven't been doing this activity very long, or you haven't had as much training in this activity as I would need you to have to fully trust you to do this use this challenging piece of equipment or something. So I think there's relationships on both of those dimensions with failure, right? Because if I decide to trust you prematurely to do something without supervision that probably I shouldn't have, and that's on me, it's my error, I might have just inadvertently led to the causing of a failure that could have been avoided. If you're talking that interpersonal trust you were talking about before, I think the more of it, the better. Right? The more we're willing to be transparent and honest with each other, and believe strongly that you won't hold it against me, that I have these shortcomings, or that I had to ask you this dumb question, or that I admitted something didn't seem to be working over here. Right, then we're going to be a more robust, safe, failure-proof team than if we didn't have that trust, that interpersonal trust.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the competence piece. I talk a lot about that in my book too, because to vulnerability, at least what I have found, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this. I get frequently asked, "Oh, you're writing a book about vulnerability. Why should we be vulnerable at work?" And I always tell people we shouldn't. Instead, we should lead with vulnerability, which is this idea of bringing together vulnerability and competence, connection and
Yeah.
competence. And what I find it too often, and we see a lot of pundits talk about this, and a lot of books have been written about this, where talk about mistakes, talk about your failures. But the more CEOs I interview, the more they tell me, if you just talk about the mistakes and failures and challenges and struggles without talking about what you're learning, how you're trying to improve, how you're trying to close the gap, what starts to happen is that vulnerability will undermine your competence. It will undermine your status, your perception of leadership. And so you have to have, right? Here's what I made a mistake versus I made a mistake, but here's what I learned and here's what I'm going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And we don't talk about that enough. It's always just space for vulnerability. It's kind of, I don't know, strange.
It's one of those things, at least, that you might be tempted to say, well, that goes without saying. But once you say that goes without saying, you're in trouble, because it's always worth saying, right? The more clarity, the better. And so if leaders out there have heard the message, gee, I got to get out there and talk about my mistakes, and I should probably do that all day long, pause, right? They've heard the wrong message, or they've heard a message and then over spread it too widely. I think the powerful advice is be willing to talk about those, frankly, not overly common moments where you did make a mistake, or where you did get something wrong, or where you did experience a failure, because you are almost by definition, and with your role and your position, advertising your successes day in and day out. I mean, you got to where you are. We without even thinking of it, we announce the good news of the company or the good news of the team. That is, the success doesn't need like a PR agent. She gets out there and announces herself rather happily and easily all the time. And people are often unaware of the degree to which they are it's fine to put a positive face forward, but they're often unaware of the degree to which their positivity and sort of saying, well, gee, I did everything right, is making it difficult for other people to be honest and transparent about what's really happening out there.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm glad we talked about the competence piece and why that still plays such a crucial role. So for the last 15, 20 minutes or so, I wanted to jump to some action items and some specific things that we can do inside of our organizations to implement some of the concepts and ideas from the book. And I thought we could open up that discussion by looking at what to do when you fail. So, and kind of like very tactically, right? Like if I fail and I'm an individual contributor versus if I'm the leader of a team and somebody on my team failed. Like, do you do, for example, a post-mortem? Do you do a one-on-one? Like, what do you actually do when the failure has been spotted and identified from an individual level and from a leadership level? Alrighty, my conversation with Amy Edmondson continues. You are not going to want to miss this, because we're going to actually take a lot of the concepts that she's been sharing around how to fail well and talk about how do you actually do it. So the first part of the conversation, really educational, exploring what these themes are. And this bonus episode for subscribers on Substack is really going to unpack this and teach you how to implement these things. Specifically, we're going to go over what do you do when you fail? So what do you do when you fail as an individual? And what do you do if you're a leader of a team and somebody on your team fails? We're also going to look at some more techniques such as learning over knowing, reframing, and this idea of stop, challenge, and choose, and what that framework looks like and how you can apply that into this science of failing well. This is only going to be available for paid subscribers on greatleadership.substack.com. Again, that is greatleadership.substack.com. And when you subscribe there, you're going to get one of these episodes every single week, as well as my series called The 5-Minute Leader, where I share quick 5-minute leadership hacks and in-depth weekly guides written by yours truly. So you can get all of that by heading over to greatleadership.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you next week.